Good day. I hope you're well, and I hope that the semester is going well as we enter into this new week. And I hope you're ready to explore the different ways that we employ logic and the different types of reasoning that we engage in. So, with no further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and let's get started with the structure of argument. How are we reasoning? So I want you to think back to some of the other presentations that we've had, some of the discussions you've engaged in, and I want you to consider how is an argument structured, and keep that in mind about what we've talked about, claim and conclusion, and the reading that you're doing for this week. And ultimately, we have the two components, right? Going back to the very first couple of weeks of classes, we have our premise and we have our conclusion, or we have premises, more than one premise. Now I'm like I usually do, I'm going to have a couple of different terms, but they all mean the same thing. But I want you to know how they're used in different philosophical, critical thinking circles. So a premise is the same thing as a major reason. And a conclusion, we are talking about them in terms of being not the concluding paragraph, but the conclusion to which somebody arrives after having done some reasoning. You can think about it also as the conclusion, the thesis statement, the conclusion for the argument. What does someone want to prove? Their major claim. I've been calling it major claim earlier. We can call it conclusion or thesis statement as sort of how you think about it in terms of argumentation. So with at least one premise and a conclusion, you've got an argument, right? And we've talked about that before. And with that premise, it's the supporting assertions or reasons that support that conclusion. And then also you've got the key assertion, or as I said, the thesis statement, that the other assertions, premises, reasons support. So here we have an example, and I'm sure you've already taken a moment to read it, so I'm not going to read it out loud for you. But what you'll see is the conclusion, the major claim, the thesis statement is underlined, and it's supported by the two premises. So government should take steps to contain and curtail the spread of gambling. That's the major claim, that's the conclusion, that's the thesis statement. Per your critical questions diagrams that you're going to be looking over this week, that would be the conclusion portion, right? And so the issue at question is how we might put that into the form of a question about the issue. The issue is the spread of gambling. That would be the issue, right? And then the issue at question, the question about the issue, would be whether or not the government should do anything to contain or curtail the spread of gambling. And then the conclusion is that underlined statement there. And then you can see that the poor spending more than others and gambling sending a negative message are the two premises that support and affirm and lead us to that conclusion. So how do we distinguish between a premise and a conclusion? So often it's the type of words. I don't mean to get too Englishy here, but we've got conjunctions and transitional words and phrases that indicate logical relationships between ideas and help us to make a distinction between a premise and a conclusion. So you've got the joining words like because or so. If we go back to the earlier example of people who gamble, notice that because indicates a premise, a reason in support of the conclusion, and the so indicates that a conclusion is to follow. Because and since typically introduce premises, whereas so, therefore, and thus, hence, and consequently often introduce conclusions. Another way to sort of think about that is you have a conclusion because of the premise, and you have a premise that therefore leads to a conclusion. So that can also help you determine what your which is which. Notice that and as well as but often connect premises. Sorry. You might have more than one premise, a compound sentence that has two reasons in it. Then you'd have the and. You might be doing some contrasting, or the arguer might be doing some contrasting. So that's when we might have a but. So you've done some reading. We're doing some talking about syllogistic form. Why should we even bother with syllogisms? What is, other than a neat logical exercise for our brains, why else might we use it? Well, when I write pure essence, what I mean is when an argument is whittled down to its syllogistic form, it's reduced to its essence, its premise and conclusion. You kind of get rid of some of the extra stuff. So it makes it a little bit easier to follow the logic. And when you radically reduce the argument into the syllogistic form, you're reducing an argument from paragraphs into a few sentences, which again helps you to analyze and understand the argument in a different way. It also becomes an outstanding outline for your argument, and so you can follow the flow of the reasoning and the thought process of the arguer by looking at the syllogistic form. Moreover, if you put your own arguments in syllogistic form, it will assist you with testing the logic and your own strength of your own reasoning in that way as well. With loving logic and real relationships, that's what I've been sort of mentioning, that ultimately syllogisms help us to pay more attention to the logic behind the relationships of our premises, the order of our premises / reasons, and how they lead to the conclusion. It also helps us to determine if we're properly using deductive or inductive reasoning. And that's it. I jumped ahead to delightful deductions, but I'll go to awesome analysis. In other words, we consider whether or not our premise actually does lead down to or guide us to our conclusion. Do our reasons and the order of our reasons lead us to the conclusion? And that finally gets us to delightful deductions. As a result, we deduce or make a deduction from our premises. We start from the top, our premise, and we work to see the logical consequences of apparently connected or disconnected premises or reasons. And so when we're looking at deductive reasoning, which we'll talk about in a few moments in more detail, the premise builds one upon the other to get us to that conclusion. So here's an example of that earlier argument put into syllogistic form. And so you'll notice here it says premise 1. It is important to consider, particularly if we're using deductive reasoning, the order of our ideas is really important. I think it's also really important in any argument we write that we need to think about the progression of our thought and how our premises and our reasons relate to each other, and which makes more sense and is more logical to come first, second, third, fourth, in order to prove our thesis statement. In other words, what's the relationship between our reasons and our premises? And how does that get us to our conclusion? I don't know if you can hear it, but my little puppers Valentino is having a little bit of a scratch fest over here. So that's him just making some of those grunting noises. All right, so you see premise one, you see premise two, and technically this would be more of a triangular, that this top dot would be in the center, but because of my computer, this is the best I can do. But that's the symbol in logic, meaning therefore. And then we've got the government. That's where sort of that thesis statement is, the major claim, the overall idea that the premises support. Okay, so let's try. So we've got capital punishment is not justified, since with capital punishment an innocent person might be executed, and no practice that might kill innocent people is justified. This is just one position on one topic, and so I want us to put that into syllogistic form. So first, I hope you would have paused it maybe and looked at what was happening there. But if we go back, notice that where do we see an and, right? So we know that if there's an and, that might be a premise, right? And we have capital punishment is not since this. And when we know that the since leads to a premise, like the word because, so then this must be the conclusion. Capital punishment is not justified, right? And now you can see how we can put that into with capital punishment, no practice, therefore, and in this instance, we're actually using a little bit more inductive reasoning in that example, and therefore it didn't really matter the order of those premises, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So with deductive reasoning, the conclusion follows of necessity from the premise if the method of the reasoning is valid. So when in your critical thinking worksheets with your critical questions, when I ask you to evaluate the reasons and determine whether or not an argument is sound, one of the things that you have to determine is the validity. Is the reasoning valid? Is the logic accurate and strong? Or are there breaks in logic? In the upcoming weeks, we'll discuss fallacies, and with fallacious reasoning, that's actually a break in logic. And so if anything has a fallacy, then it's all going against the rules of logic. The reasoning would therefore be invalid, and therefore it would have be an unsound argument. I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but I think the more I share this and say this, the more it'll make sense as we continue to go through and support what you've already read in your textbook. So with the deductive reasoning, the order of the premises, they need to go in a specific order, because one leads to two, which leads to three, or however many you have, which gets you to your conclusion. And with deductive reasoning, you cannot arrive at any other conclusion than the one if the premises are the reasoning is valid, the structure is sound, so on and so forth. So I've changed this because this is a famous quotation, but it used to say man, and I like to be a little bit more inclusive. So all people are mortal. Socrates is a person, therefore Socrates is mortal, even if some of us might think he's immortal, right? Now notice that we've got a couple of categories here. One, we have people, that's one category. Mortality is another category, or you might call it a classification. And then we've got a third category or classification with Socrates. Now notice the first premise is saying all people are mortal. There's a bit of a claim in that, right? Socrates is a person. Well, if Socrates is a person, then he fits in this all people, therefore he's mortal. So do we see that this is the reasoning is valid because it says Socrates is mortal. Because first we proved that all people are mortal, then we proved that Socrates is a person, therefore we can conclude that Socrates is mortal. We can't logically arrive at any other conclusion from these listed premises and the way that they are phrased. And that's what also helps us to see that it's deductive reasoning. Now, when we get to inductive reasoning with an inductive argument, the conclusion can only follow of some degree of probability, from the unlikely to the highly probable. And you're going to find that there are different arguments where you're going to want to try to use deductive reasoning more, and there's other arguments where inductive reasoning is all that is available to us. With some of your earlier arguments for your essays, you're going to be able to use more deductive reasoning, but by the time you get to your final essay for the class, where you're going to be proposing a policy or a program to improve a problem, it's going to be your own program and it's new, and so you're going to be using a lot of inductive reasoning because you're going to do your best to show the logical progression of thought and that your conclusion will arrive from your reasons, but there's going to be more probability to it because you're going to make claims about what should happen and how things should be remedied, but because your program hasn't been implemented, it's not proven that that's true. So hopefully you're able to see that inductive reasoning is useful and necessary. Especially, we'll see it a lot in the sciences when with hypotheses and people are exploring and trying to confirm their hypotheses. And then once they gather the information, they can switch to deductive reasoning, which is a little bit harder to refute. So here's an example of an argument, an inductively reasoned argument. The Problems of Philosophy, British philosopher Bertrand Russell states, quote, "The man who has fed the chicken every day throughout its life at last wrings its neck instead." So now I want you to think about, we're going to kind of put ourselves in the chicken's perspective, and we're going to act as if the chicken has reasoning faculties. So the chicken is going to reason. Here's the chicken's argument. Premise 1, he, being the farmer, has fed me today. Premise 2, although anybody can be a farmer, he has fed me this next day too. Premise 3, he has fed me this day too. He has fed me yet another day. And he can continue to go on, or she, the chicken, can, but therefore he will feed me tomorrow. Now, the chicken has made a prediction, and it's a reasonable one based on past experience, is it not? And one can see the progression of thought, but you can also see that this conclusion doesn't follow of necessity from these premises, as it did with the deductively reasoned argument. In this one, in fact, we could come to a completely different conclusion with these same set of premises. But for this argument, these premises can also support this argument. Whereas with our deductively reasoned argument, you couldn't come to a different conclusion. Those premises will only and always lead to the same conclusion. Okay, so here's the differences with the reasoning types. And the whole enchilada means in a deductively reasoned argument, the premises contain all of the information needed to get to the conclusion or for the conclusion to make sense. Whereas with a inductively reasoned argument, we have more flexibility. I like to call it coloring outside the lines, because sometimes the premises will go beyond the conclusion. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes the premises can lead to multiple conclusions. And there's a probability that they could lead to the multiple conclusions in the same way. And be logical for each. hypotheses first. Sometimes with our inductively reasoned arguments, we begin with a hypothesis. Go back and think to your scientific method and this unproved theory or proposition, and then we gather data to support it, and then we use the information about the observed cases in order to reach a conclusion about the unobserved cases. Ultimately, for this reason, that the inductively reasoned argument is a little bit less definitive and a little more loosey-goosey. Some prefer the certainty of deductive reasoning to the probability of inductive reasoning. But I'm sure that you're thinking in your own mind, from your own experience or from different classes you've taken, different decisions you've made, where you have used inductive and deductive reasoning. So here's another example. You're going to notice also with our deductively reasoned arguments that our inference, go back to what we talked about, inference, judgment, and fact. Our inference usually moves from a more general idea, and then it gets more particular and specific, and the instance or example that fits that generalization. So we move from the general, sort of broad, to the more specific. So all students who complete this course, meaning English 103, successfully will fulfill the critical thinking requirement for GE and transfer. Sophia has completed this course successfully. Therefore, Sophia has fulfilled the critical thinking requirement. Again, we have all students who complete this course successfully. That's one classification or category. Will fulfill the critical thinking requirement. Another classification, Sophia has completed this course successfully. Therefore, if she is a part of the students who complete the course successfully, then she has fulfilled the critical thinking requirement. Logically, we cannot come to any other conclusion than this. These premises do not lead us to any other conclusion than the one that we've referred to. And we went from all students to a more specific student. Here's another inductive example where the deductively reasoned argument goes from the more general to the more specific. You're going to find that the inductively reasoned argument goes from a more generalized perspective and then gets to a more specific conclusion. So if you read through premise 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you have a lot of different reasons there, a lot of different premises, right? And they all have to deal with the environment in some way. What's interesting though, does it really make a difference if the order, other than we might want to put the water ideas clearer to each other, there might be a logic in the terms of if we were writing this essay and each of these premises were a paragraph, we might reorder them to have the sky, to have the earth, to have the water related items sort of in order, because that would make a logical progression of thought. But in terms of our example here for inductive reasoning, notice that it's not as precise. We don't have to be as precise about the order of our premise for the logic to make sense as we do for our deductively reasoned arguments. And then notice we take these real general examples and we get to a very specific conclusion about global warming. Can you also see that with that last example that we could have also come to a different conclusion about the environment? It didn't just have to be about climate change or global warming, right? So in order for an argument to be sound, what does a sound argument need? And with some of what you read, you may have seen that there are two things. I've already been talking about validity, but there needs to be, the argument needs to be valid and there needs to be truthfulness. And we're speaking particularly for deductively reasoned arguments and syllogisms, we've got the valid conclusion. The conclusion follows from the premises of necessity, and each premise is true and or acceptable. When you're looking at your critical questions about reasons and ambiguities diagram, you're going to see some things to consider when you're evaluating. And when you look at your critical thinking worksheet and examples, you're also going to see what we're talking, that's the evaluation of the reasons. Are they acceptable? Are they true? Are they logical, right? Or in and of itself, can you tell just off the bat that it's untrue or invalid? And the validity has to do with the strength of the reasoning, and the truthfulness has to do with the acceptability of each reason or premise. So when and this is what I just mentioned, the conclusion, if an argument is valid, the conclusion follows of necessity from the premise or premises. Correct form is the form of the argument is correct. And that's what we've been talking about, the order of the premises, and then the conclusion. The rules of logic. Do the lines of reasoning conform to the rules of logic? And that's what you've been reading about and what we've been discussing briefly here today. And then the valid structure is the structure of the argument or the syllogism valid. The form, the flow of the reasoning and logic to the conclusion, is that valid? Then you want to take each premise, each reason, one at a time. And that's why you'll see in the examples for the critical thinking worksheet for this week and for your future use, that you want to identify each reason in the argument that you're analyzing. And then you have a section where you evaluate each reason. And you're going to practice doing that this week with your reading quizzes. And so you've got you take each reason and you isolate it, and you look to see if that reason, that premise, has been adequately supported, explained, and if it therefore establishes a reasonable, acceptable point, idea, position. And we want to also analyze and evaluate each reason or premise prior to getting to the conclusion. Now, if we have both a valid structure, a valid form, valid use of logic and reasoning, and we have true and or acceptable reasons or premises, then we have a sound argument. However, if one of these things is out of whack, then we have an unsound argument. So please see that being valid is different from the soundness, right? The soundness is the entire argument altogether, and that deals with logic, the strength of logic and reasoning of the entire argument, or the unsoundness of the argument. Being valid, that's the actual form of the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. So if we have an invalid form, the premises don't prove the conclusion, don't lead to that conclusion, then we have an invalid form. Then it would be unsound, even if the premises were true and acceptable. And conversely, if we had a valid form, but even one of the 6 or 7 premises in the argument, if one of them is untrue or unacceptable, the entire argument is unsound. Now, this is really interesting, and I really want you to come back to this concept throughout the rest of the semester, because this has nothing to do with persuasiveness. And I really am hoping that you will be able to see the difference and identify the difference between any sort of argument you read or hear, that you will be able to determine whether the argument's sound or unsound, and then separate that from whether or not the argument is persuasive or not. Because we can have a lot of persuasive arguments that are not bound by logic or follow the rules of logic or employ reasoning, but they can still be persuasive. But if we are being a true critical thinker, we should not be persuaded by unsound arguments, because we should be working from a place of logic and reason, and therefore we would only want to support and uphold sound arguments. And the same thing is true for us when we create our own arguments. We want to have that persuasive element, but more importantly, we want to create those sound, rock solid logical arguments, so that it's harder for anyone to poke holes in our argument or refute our argument. So that makes it even stronger for us. So let's go to determining, is this sound or unsound? So we have one, drift net fishing kills dolphins. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but what drift net fishing is when people it's just like it sounds. The nets drift behind the boat and just capture everything along with the net. And so that is a proven, just so if we're going, is that true and acceptable? Yes, it's a proven fact. It does happen. Mermaid tuna uses drift nets. Do we think that's true and acceptable? Well, for our purposes here, the last time I looked this up, it was factual. So let's go ahead and say, yep, that's true and acceptable. So are we halfway toward a sound argument? We have two premises. We've evaluated them. They seem true and acceptable. Can we also see that in the syllogistic form, we can imagine if this were a developed argument, that we would have more information to help prove drift net fishing kills dolphins, right? And maybe even statistics of the numbers of dolphins killed, and where they're killed, and then mermaid tuna's use and how often they've used it, and where they use it, and so on and so forth. So we have that. Now let's look at whether we think it's validity. So we have one classification, one idea, drift net fishing kills dolphins. That's the second bit. Mermaid tuna uses drift nets. So if mermaid tuna uses drift net fishing, then they kill dolphins. Mermaid tuna kills dolphins. So is that valid? Does that conclusion follow from necessity from those two premises in that order? And I think we are all going to say, yes, it's sound, because the premises are acceptable and true, and the structure is valid. And we also know, because of that, that this is a deductively reasoned argument, right? Sound or unsound? So again, we're going to practice this, taking each reason, evaluating it on its own, judging its acceptability or truthfulness. All Englishmen are volatile. Is that true? And if you're saying no, why are you saying no? And is it because of the word all? And you're going to be, like I said earlier, reading about fallacies soon. But essentially, this is a fallacy. This is a hasty generalization. Saying all of anything, doing something, if there's one instance where one person doesn't fit within that category, then your whole argument is blown. It's untrue. And if we know any English folks then who aren't volatile, then we know that this is untrue. So by virtue of this one premise not being true and not being acceptable, it's untrue, it's unacceptable, this argument's already unsound. Do we see how that's true? Even if the other premise is true and acceptable, and even if the structure is valid, because of that one premise, this is now an unsound argument. But let's finish our exercise here. Edward is English. Is that a true and acceptable? We can verify that, sure. Now let's look at the structure. All Englishmen, volatile. Edward is English, therefore Edward is volatile. The structure is valid, isn't it? And this is also an example of deductive reasoning. That conclusion, we couldn't get to any other conclusion than that conclusion from these premises. So we are following the rules of logic and strong reasoning use, but because of that one premise being untrue, the entire argument is unsound. So let's do this one. I'm going to let you do this one in your head and sort of consider and think about where you are with this. But do you think this is sound or unsound? Well, if you said unsound, you're absolutely right. And the reason is this is interesting. I just got done saying hasty generalization, but isn't this one instance where saying all is acceptable and is not a hasty generalization? So we still need to use our own reasoning and logic when we are even evaluating things and making our own definitive statements. All athletes are people, all football players are people, all football players are athletes. Those statements are true, yes, but the form does not guarantee the conclusion. Does this premise lead to this premise, which leads to this conclusion? No, it doesn't. These two premises do not get us to this conclusion. However, if we were to say all athletes are people, football players are athletes, therefore football players are people, then that conclusion would follow of necessity. So even though we have acceptable premises, we have an unsound structure, and the structure is invalid, and the premises don't lead to that conclusion. Therefore, this is an unsound argument. Now, you're going to rarely see that your arguments are going to be so perfectly laid out like this. But what's sort of fun, at least for me, being the English geek, critical thinking geek that I am, I love when I hear in popular culture different folks using syllogisms. And it can be a lot of fun to identify it and look at the soundness. But either way, the principles in putting things in syllogistic form, analyzing things in syllogistic form can be applied to any argument. And you should be thinking about these things when you're looking at your conclusions, your major claim, your thesis statement, or your premises, your reasons, your evidence, as you are constructing your own arguments and analyzing other arguments. I want to talk a little bit about class logic because I think it helps us to visualize. You've heard me talk about this as a different classification, a different category. If we can look, we often use class logic in our life, and it's just the relationship between classifications of people, places, and things. And it can help us with our own understanding of these people, places, and things, but it can also help us with determining the types of logic we're employing, the types of reasoning we're employing. And so when you talk about inclusion, that's, what do you think that means? Just inclusion, including. It's a relationship between classes or classifications where members of one class are also a member of another class, right? And exclusion is the relationship between classes that, what? You guessed it, it's exclusive, it's excluding. So no members of either class, they are exclusive of each other, they do not share any members. And then we've got overlap, and you can imagine if one group of members is included in another group for inclusion and exclusion has separate members, then overlap is there's a sharing of members, right? Some members fit into both categories. when I talk about class logic, I tend to use Euler diagrams. Some of you might know these better as a Venn diagram, but Euler is an 18th century mathematician who uses these diagrams to illustrate the various relationships between items in a class. And so, for the first one, which is which with these Euler diagrams? So pro athletes and pro basketball players. So notice the outer circle is the larger circle, and much like when we're looking at our syllogisms, it is important where these ideas are placed. So all pro athletes are all pro basketball players also pro athletes? They're two different classifications, but do the pro basketball players fit also within the pro athletes? And if we agree with that, then that's inclusion, right? Now, handguns and rifles, they're different classifications. We could say they are both firearms, but that would be a third classification, right? But in and of themselves, handguns and rifles are separate. And so they are they represent exclusion. And then, although I can't get the little circle here, this should have a little white line right here too, because yes, this is overlap. Rock stars and guitarists. Some rock stars are guitarists, some guitarists are rock stars, but not all guitarists are rock stars, and not all rock stars are guitarists. But there is some overlap. And I think many guitarists wish that they were rock stars. So I want you to kind of think of this on your own, and what you're going to find with this, and just sort of do this on your own. What you're going to find is the first few are pretty easy, but when we get to more controversial topics toward the bottom of this list, what you're going to find is your own worldview about these topics, your own inferences and judgments about these topics will inform how you view the relationship between the classifications. So cantaloupes and watermelon, what do you think they are? Inclusion, exclusion, or overlap? And hopefully you're saying exclusion, right? Because cantaloupes and watermelon, although they're both in the melon category and are a type of melon, they are separate, just like handguns and rifles, right? How about judges and lawyers? If you know anything about judges and lawyers, we're going to have inclusion, but which one's going to be on the outside? So if you want to be a judge, you have to have a law degree. It doesn't mean you have to have practiced law, but you are technically a lawyer. So we would have lawyers on the outside circle, and then we would have judges included in the lawyers, because not all lawyers are judges, but all judges are lawyers. How about Volkswagens and convertible? Volkswagen cars, convertible cars. That would be overlap. That's right, because some Volkswagen cars are convertibles, some convertibles are Volkswagens, but they aren't all Volkswagens, and not all Volkswagens are convertibles. How about cosmetics and hairspray? Depends how you define these terms, and you're reading about the importance of defining terms. And this is important for your own arguments, especially your audience. You're writing to an audience who isn't as familiar with your topics as you are, right? Think about our class community. That's who you're writing to, people with varying levels of understanding and knowledge. So you need to provide some of that information. You've done some reading about how important it is. We've done some talking about audience identification. And so you want to make sure that you are filling in any gaps for your audience. So cosmetics, some of you might have put hairspray inclusive within the larger cosmetics. Some of you maybe thought of cosmetics as just being makeup and hairspray as being hair products, so you might have made them exclusive. But if you were thinking about cosmetics as being all the sorts of materials that we use to dress up ourselves, then that's why you might have put inclusion. Some of you maybe even did overlap. How about the homeless and the mentally ill? This is where it gets a little bit tricky, depending upon your point of view. And some of you may be doing inclusion because of the way that you view different people. Some of you may be doing exclusion, but I think overlap can be proven. At one point under President Ronald Reagan, he closed many of the mental health institutions and people didn't have places to go. And so there were mentally ill people who were homeless on the street. And I think we have that today, but we also have people who are homeless that are very mentally healthy and capable. It's due to circumstance, right? Thinking about, especially today with what's happening in the world with the pandemic. So overlap might be the more logical. And then euthanasia and suicide, again, it depends on your worldview. It depends on how you perceive and understand euthanasia, which is defined as a physician-assisted suicide, and that's an interesting definition, and we might not agree with that definition, but if suicide's in the definition, is it suicide? But if it's assisted by somebody else, is it suicide? Or might some people, and some people do, call it murder rather than assisting someone else to end one's life? So again, notice that we have different classifications, but with every argument, with every controversial issue, things are always a little bit deeper than what we see on the surface. And something that we think is just a real easy, quick topic, the more we delve into it, the more we think critically about it, the more we see how far-reaching the topic is and the various implications, the ramifications of changing something, of not changing something. And so I'll leave that one for you to determine for yourself. Okay, let's go back to our original syllogism about Socrates. Another way I've been talking about, there's one classification, here's another classification. If you want to get more into the English talk, you've got people, that's the subject, predicate, that's leaning toward more of the verb phrase, right? And so part one, part two, and then Socrates is a person, right? And then goes up to there. But remembering, let's look at what that might look like. So we have actually three different classifications, if you recall, right? People, mortality, mortal, and then Socrates. So what if we are, this is a great way to use, to check our, the validity of our reasoning, especially when we're employing deductive reasoning. So if we can do a Euler diagram that shows inclusion from the first category classification to the second to the third to however many classifications, that will help us to gauge whether or not, visually, whether or not we are employing valid reasoning and succumbing to the rules of logic. So mortality, that's the outer circle, right? All people are mortal. So if all people are mortal, mortality is on the outside. And then we have people, right? And then we have Socrates. And so now do you see that we're seeing visually what we were doing with our words and with our reason and with our logic. And this is another way for us to gauge that, yes, this is the structure of this argument is valid. And because we've already talked about premise one is acceptable, premise two is acceptable, this is then a sound argument. All right, friends, that's it. Go get your reasoning on. I can't wait to see how you apply all that we've gone through today, and I wish you well. Bye-bye.